You're up. Hot seats up there. Just we can't really start until we have our scribe here though, but you can set up and what have you.
It's a pretty easy setup, Mr. Chairman.
You'll sit down, do you think?
That's permissible.
It is. Right. But we'll just wait for our scribe to come back. So, here she comes. So it's 59, part 2, page 51. And it's submission 59. Right, so same deal as normal, 10 minutes, and we take your submission as read, and it's helpful if we can ask you questions if that's what you want, but it's your time.
Thank you. Is that right? She all right now? Yep. Now, Taiao have certainly been a major supporter of the preparation of the biodiversity strategy, and Taiao and its members have been very actively involved with the Regional Council and others in the preparation of the draft strategy. We totally support it, have done from year one. So, just a couple of things with it. Certainly, the biodiversity strategy is a strategy for the region, and that's what the Regional Council have done. The Regional Council have done a great job in coordinating the process and with the stakeholder group in preparing the document that's been prepared to date. The Regional Council have a major statutory responsibility under the Resource Management Act for biodiversity, as does the Department of Conservation, primarily on the conservation estate. So from a funding perspective for the biodiversity strategy, we support the $40,000 for a coordinator, tick in the box. What we're basically saying is there should be quite a substantial grant to the Biodiversity Trust or group to basically kick-start it. We're aware that certain funding within pest control has biodiversity outcomes, but certainly most other regional councils that are preparing a biodiversity strategy have a clearly defined budget for its implementation. And what would be useful is those parts of the current regional council budget under pest control, or some of it might be under the regional land care scheme, if they've got some clear biodiversity outputs, they could be shown. They could actually stay there, but on a sub-budget to the side is shown as biodiversity funding. There's a lot of good biodiversity work going on. There's also some huge gaps. The funding support from the Regional Council for the Cape to the City project, commendable, but in my opinion, because it was first project off the ranks, high profile, has actually captured a very significant proportion of the potential funding from you folk before even the biodiversity strategy's got to the next step. So we still believe that there should be a substantial grant to kickstart the program. The Biodiversity Trust that's being set up, it's important they're there because it's important biodiversity protection and management in Hawke's Bay has access to funding from other sources outside central government, outside the regional council system. And to have a trust there managing that part of it enables that to happen. Having said that, the Regional Council's still got this major responsibility under the Resource Management Act for biodiversity protection, and we feel there should be a very substantial grant made to it to kick-start it. Wetlands is a key area that's been neglected. There used to be a very substantial fund within the Regional Council 10 years ago for wetland management, some really good stuff done. Somehow that got sidetracked, captured somewhere else, and it's been lost. So that's it. You've got clear, our Regional Council, which is you folk, have got clear statutory responsibilities for biodiversity, and it's important that some clearly identified substantial grant made to kickstart that trust. In terms of Taiao funding application, I've read the staff reports, both on the biodiversity strategy and Taiao, and don't necessarily agree with everything that's said there, but you know, that's not bloody out of the ordinary. It's important that we have slightly different views on certain things, but just like to remind the council that the reason environmental and conservation groups are more actively involved at the stakeholder level and through the statutory processes like the long-term plan, regional policy statement, Tookie plan change, etc., is because of Taiao. All right? Taiao was the sticking plaster that brought all the groups together and got them involved. And these are not groups that are anti-regional council. There's some issues that Taiao and the groups might have different views on, but we support a lot of the good work that our regional council is doing. So, while Taiao is a bit of a loose, overarching group with all these other fruits of organisations hanging underneath it, Forest and Bird and others, I think Taiao has been a very effective organisation in trying to actually pull together the environmental group's interest in the future of the region. In addition to that, some of the staff may or may not know, there's one or two regional council staff have moved on, like Tim Sharp, but Taiao has been helpful, in my opinion, in terms of helping specific regional council staff make contact with other groups. We've convened one or two meetings in Ruatana for water storage in terms of environmental groups, which was for HBRC. They didn't know who to go to. Taiao was able to do that very, very quickly and efficiently in terms of a one-stop stop in terms of who to talk to. So the Regional Council has good relationships with the likes of the primary sector groups. They may not be funding that because the primary sector groups are a commercial organisation, unlike Taiao, which is a community grassroots group funded out of our own pockets. You have the Nature Central agreement with DOC, that's good. But part of the reason that Taiao is having to actually do some of the work that we're involved with and become involved with the Regional Council is, may I say it, my dear old Department of Conservation. I was the first manager in town. The Department of Conservation's involvement with the statutory processes now is just about zilch. They have a clear statutory role to advocate for conservation. They're not doing it. Taiao and the groups that make up Taiao are actually having, at a community level, have to step up and do it. DOC are still doing some good stuff, but they've really dropped the ball in that area. Another good example, you know, and I support it, the Regional Council have a Māori committee. They've funded certain works through the Hiratonga Tai Whenua, not too unlike some of the things that we're talking about Taiao. I'm sure if we'd had a better collaborative approach, and members of Taiao, many of them have got a lot of knowledge locally, not just myself, but also technically have quite a good knowledge. If we'd worked more closely with staff, I'm sure some of the problems of litigation and the cost of it to the Regional Council, Regional Policy Statement Change 5 is a good one. It would have been a hell of a lot less. All those days of arbitration there in front of an independent facilitator would have been a lot shorter if we'd done a little bit of homework and the Regional Council had actually recognised that Taiao could have contributed to that in a positive way. Taiao's committed to the future of the region. We're not a bunch of rabid greenies, as I think I mentioned 3 years ago when we were here talking about the biodiversity strategy. At least two of the chairmen of Forest and Bird here were all grey-headed old buggers. But passionately, there's certain things in Hawke's Bay that we want to see happen and we're here to help. we're knowledgeable. I maintain that we've got a helpful attitude. All right? You haven't seen Taiao in the press lately, have you? Over dam and stuff. This is the responsible attitude that we're taking. We've got certain views on certain things, but we'd prefer to be sitting down with the Regional Council, working through it in a collaborative, consultative and responsible sort of a way. I know you get a lot of applications out of the blue for funding, and ours is no different, but what I'd like to encourage you to think about, in spite of what the staff report says, is that you support in principle the concept of funding Taiao, and some of the councillors and some of the staff work with Taiao in the near future to actually sit down and just finally confirm what Taiao can deliver of value and interest to the Regional Council, and out of that develop a memorandum of understanding that allows us to work more closely and collaboratively together, but helped and funded partly by the Regional Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cheyne, and thank you for your presentation. Your 10 minutes are up, and thanks very much.
No room for questions?
Well, you didn't allow us any, so...
I'm sorry, I must have misunderstood because I was watching your clock.
Yeah.
Yep.
Anyway, good on you. Thank you, and we'll be in touch in due course. So, thank you.
Okay.
Right, who we got now? Forest and Bird, Amelia Geary. Excuse me.
Part 1, page 43 for this submission.
So just so, and I'll repeat what I said before because I was quite clear, 10 minutes. If you want us to ask questions, they have to be within your 10 minutes. Take your submission as read and the floor is yours. So, welcome.
Just push the button. Yep.
Thank you. Thanks very much for allowing us time to speak. I'm not as good an orator as Mr. Cheyne, so I'm going to read my what I've prepared. Hopefully, I've only got a few things to say, particularly regarding, well, what I consider to be question 7, which is referring to the that long-term plan document that you submitted initially, looking after our waterways. Oh, and I should mention this is on behalf of the Havelock North branch of Forest and Bird. So we've said most of what we wanted to say with regard to looking after our waterways in our original submission. We support the increase in spending on monitoring the state of and the health of the region's wetlands, major rivers. But we'd like to reiterate what we mentioned in our submission, which was in regard to surface and groundwater monitoring and how that's used. So I have, I'll get to those handouts that you are receiving now, but freshwater, this document that you've just been handed, the black one, it's a book by Mike Joy, who I'm sure you all have heard of, and he shows quite clearly in that document, it's on page, well, it's on the under the page, the government response to freshwater in this country, and he explains how use of monitoring data for freshwater can be misleading if not enough time is used. So the length of time versus the number of samples you take improves the statistical analysis of the data. So I just wanted to make the point that while we totally support increased spending on monitoring, we'd also like to see a good comprehensive review of actually how that data is used, because currently, as Mike Joy has pointed out with Ministry of the Environment reporting, and it's also used in your State of the Environment reporting, 5-year timeframes are not long enough to actually give a really comprehensive overview of what that data is actually saying and how the health of the river is actually being reflected. So I just kind of wanted to point that out. I realise it's not to do with money, but I wanted to emphasise that if you're going to put money into this, then hopefully some of that can be channelled towards how this data is presented in your monitoring and the results, the reports that you produce for the environment. So yeah, and I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that well-informed decisions also need good information, which is what you're putting money towards, but also good interpretation of that information that you're collecting. And on that note, with regard to state of the environment reporting, as Mr. Cheyne pointed out, the regional councils have the express function under the RMA to not just manage for biodiversity, but to develop and implement objectives, policies and methods to maintain biodiversity. And while this isn't under waterways, it's something that comes under your state of the environment reporting. And we'd like to suggest that to meet state of the environment reporting requirements, development of a meaningful biodiversity monitoring program at a level that's commensurate with the other regional functions relating to freshwater and the other monitoring methods that you implement across the region with regard to soil and water air quality. We'd like to emphasise that something of that nature is also required for biodiversity, and I know that that's in the pipeline, but I'd like to stress that that's really important from our view under the RMA as an obligation of the council to not only present state of the environment reporting for water, but also biodiversity as well, and to actually have something that's showing the maintenance of biodiversity and not the ongoing loss which is occurring across the country. So we'd like to see some long-term plan funding towards that as well. And I'm pretty sure Hawke's Bay Regional Council is part of the EMA Environmental and Reporting Group, which is a collaborative process with all the regional councils and MFE. Yeah, so we'd just like to emphasise that that's something really important we'd like to see funded. So the other major point I wanted to make was with regard to the biodiversity strategy, as we've heard from the passionate Taiao group. We recognise that it's a hugely ambitious task for the council that requires proactive intervention, as not just reactive measures. It also relies on actions by other parties. So we applaud your collaborative approach with developing the biodiversity strategy in collaboration with DOC and various other stakeholders. And as pointed out by Mr. Cheyne, we also acknowledge that you have put money into other biodiversity strategy or biodiversity mitigation measures like pest control, animal pest budgets and so on. And we're glad to see you've put money towards this Cape to City project, and like Mr. Cheyne pointed out, that could also be strategically placed into the implementation of the biodiversity strategy to maybe be a bit more meaningful across Hawke's Bay. But we'd like to just emphasise that there is an obligation to maintain biodiversity across the region, and that comes with financial obligations. We would like to see the Regional Council provide leadership from a biodiversity perspective. While the biodiversity strategy was developed in collaboration with DOC and other parties, ultimately, like Taiao pointed out, it's DOC and regional councils that ultimately are statutorily mandated to provide for biodiversity across the region, and to ensure that ongoing loss doesn't continue. So therefore, yeah, we would support quite a lot more funding, up to the tune of maybe $500,000, to support the implementation of the biodiversity strategy, to fund someone that can drive this forward on behalf of the council. And as it's seen with other councils in parts of the country, we'd like to see this continual, not just $500,000 this year, but in consequent years afterwards, to show that Hawke's Bay Regional Council is the leader in biodiversity across the region, and particularly given that the Department of Conservation is going through some tough times right now, it's a good time to take the lead on this. And finally, with regard to pest control, we'd like to acknowledge the contribution that Hawke's Bay Regional Council is proposing to take over the TB-free New Zealand possum control, and would like to make mention of the fact that it's not just important from an agricultural perspective, but also important from a climate change perspective. 2 minutes to go. 2 minutes to go, okay. So I put forward another document that I've only put in excerpts just so for your information, and that's a report written by a scientist at Landcare that shows in quite some detail about climate change's impacts on biodiversity nationally and how important that is, that we need to start addressing these issues. So I'd just like to emphasise that predator control across the country, across the region is important, and particularly possums but other browsers like goats in Hawke's Bay, as they are currently undermining the carbon sink of the environment, undermining the forests. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. And also to support Te Taiao's application for funding, because as they rightly pointed out, they're an important leader in conservation and biodiversity action across the region. So that leaves me a minute to answer questions.
I'll kick off a question. Te Taiao have asked us for funding, which you support. But Te Taiao is the umbrella group, but it is in effect just become another group that we have to deal with on the basis that we still have submissions to our plan from 2 forest and bird groups, just as one example. So how do you see Te Taiao actually adding value to what we do when in effect it is just yet one more group we have to deal with?
Their strength is in their connectivity across the region with all the environmental voices. So they are an important voice as an independent group in their own right, but can also they would like to work more closely with regional council, and they could potentially be the one that then feeds out to the regions in terms of our branches. I recognise that, yes, they're another group, but they're an important voice and represent a large number of environmental groups.
Thank
Community
you.
voice.
Just
yeah.
in finishing though, we have those direct relationships with you guys. So I say again, they're just another group. Come and add more clutter to our conversation, potentially. Anyway, time's up, guys. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
And we will be in touch.